1967 was an awesome year for Buick, and perhaps, well, let's just say maybe even the best in its entire history. The entire Buick lineup for 1967 was just a group of stunning vehicles. Everything from this LeSabre coupe that you see here, to the Riviera, to the Electra four-door that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. All the Buicks that were in the showroom for 1967 were stellar automobiles inside and out and mechanically. Nearly flawless vehicles, something that I honestly don't think Buick was able to replicate after this time frame. So let's talk a little bit more about these 1967 Buicks and what makes them so special. Let's begin with the styling of the 1967 Buicks because I think it's just absolutely fantastic. I don't know how to describe the styling with another adjective other than that. And let's begin with who designed these. Well, the chief designer for Buick during this time frame was a gentleman by the name of Dave Holls, Holls. And Dave would go on to design a number of key General Motors vehicles. He played a significant role in the 1968 Corvette, as well as the 1970 and a half Camaro, 1970 Monte Carlo, as well as the 67 Riviera, of course, done while he was in charge of the Buick studio. So Dave had a number of hits during this time frame and slightly after that, and he also played a pretty big role in the 1992 Cadillac Seville and Eldorado as well, which were designed under Dick Rusin, but Dave was also leading the advanced studios for General Motors at that time. Now take a look at this side profile of the 67 LeSabre coupe that you see here, and you see just mastery of form and line in this vehicle. Take a look at that feature line. Some would call it a swage line that starts at the tip of the fender and then beautifully continues, kind of arcs downward along the door, then levels out over the rear wheel, forms kind of a semi-skirted rear wheel there, and goes all the way out back. And then the LeSabre script is above that feature line, and then the feature line is aligned with the bumper. And you notice the overall form of that line changes as it moves throughout the vehicle. So up front, it's less pronounced, and as it gets toward the rear of the door, it becomes increasingly pronounced, and you can see the light breaking over the top of that feature line as well as the bottom, and it just makes this body really sing from a styling perspective. Frankly, I can't think of a Ford of this era that had similar feature lines on the body side and interest and beautiful levels of surfacing. Chrysler had some interesting ones in the mid-60s, particularly some with the concave surfacing on the body sides like the full-size Chryslers. But here you also have the so-called Coke bottle styling in its waning years for General Motors. And what does that mean? Well, the body is flaring up and out around that rear wheel, and you can see that clearly the belt line rises there after the door terminates, but the body also starts to become wider at that same point. And this was the waning years, at least for General Motors with the Coke bottle styling. Ford would continue that Coke bottle styling into the 1970s on cars like the Torino. Here's another view of the body side from a different angle, and notice again how that feature line starts out relatively faint and gets increasingly pronounced as it goes back on the car, and it creates this beautiful dark shadow underneath it once that feature line or swage line gets past the door cut there, and it kind of gives the body an overall slimmer look because you're creating this shadow, or the body is throwing a shadow on itself as that feature line becomes more pronounced. I just think it's absolutely stunning. What a beautiful piece of art. And of course, you have this beautiful arcing roof on this fastback coupe. This would be the waning years of the fastback coupes for General Motors. They would be gone by the late 1960s. It was a bit of a fad that came and went relatively quickly, but I don't think there's a bad General Motors full-size fastback coupe from any of the divisions. They all look stellar. Cadillac never had a fastback coupe. They only had the formal roof line on their coupes. It was pretty stiff, and I think it still looked good, but it was just a totally different look on their coupes for the time. Now we're going to transition from that 67 LeSabre to this 67 Electra, and let's start at the rear. First, you notice this vertical theme, these almost fins on the car, and this began in the 1963 model year when the Electra as well as the Olds 98 went with this vertical theme out back and really were trying to emulate Cadillac, that is why they got this vertical theme. And you notice the LeSabre didn't have something similar. So the Electra as well as the 98 during this time frame had that vertical theme. They didn't necessarily have the lamps in that quarter panel. You can see here this is clearly a full-width tail light, which would become a Buick signature for years to come, even on cars like the Buick Riata in the 1980s. But here it is on this 67 Electra and looking rather handsome indeed. Now, I have to say that there are some interesting things about this. Notice the bumper is relatively big on this car, and that's reflecting the ground because it's chrome. One of the benefits of that is that it helps to make the overall body look slimmer and trimmer because that chrome bumper is reflecting the ground, and yet the body is, of course, something that your eye notices. So while the car is large out back, it doesn't look as visually large. Imagine if that bumper were a painted surface, how big it would look. And that's, I think, one of the things that cars suffer from today, or at least the crossovers, is there's nothing to break up these rather large forms. And so they just look kind of bulky and not all that great, I guess, to describe them. That's about as well as I can describe them. Now notice the designers also gave the deck lid some interesting shapes here. It's not just your standard run-of-the-mill deck lid, but it actually has this form within it, almost like somebody was on the underside of the deck lid and pushed up on it. And it creates this beautiful surface that the light kind of breaks over. You can see it here in this metallic gray car. And that gives the vehicle some extra dimension. And I love how the clay sculptors, as well as the designers that worked with them, kind of sculpted this surface. And it has a beautiful fillet and radius combo that just takes in that light and reflects it so wonderfully. And something that you just don't see again on cars today. Now let's look at the body side of this 67 Electra four-door hardtop. And you notice that similar feature line or swage line that we had on the 67 LeSabre Coupe, although the surfacing is rather different. Notice the feature line here, while it is faint, where it starts out at the tip of the fender and then does get a bit more pronounced, after the end of the front fender, as you move rearward on the car, it really doesn't get sharply more pronounced as it did on the LeSabre Coupe. Just a little bit. So the surfacing here is different. And you can see the similar Coke bottle styling with that door kick-up and the body flaring out over the rear wheel. Also notice how the light is breaking on that rear door. You can actually see the surface and how it's getting bigger. It's just, again, a beautiful treatment of the surfacing that is catching the light on this metallic paint car. And you can also see what I meant, how that feature line kind of makes the rear quarter panel look more slim because the area below the feature line is shadowed. It's kind of in the shadows, and so it makes that body side look more slim and trim. Of course, this is an Electra, so it has 4 portholes, or the technical term ventaports on it, as opposed to the LeSabre Coupe, which just had 3. Now, turning to the inside for a second, this is a very special 1967 Electra Coupe because it has just 372 miles on the odometer. I said that right, 372 miles, and just wait till I show you some pictures of the seats and the upholstery in greater detail than this. But for now, admire the very thin 3-spoke steering wheel that was a Buick exclusive during this time. So not only did you get better view of the gauges, but you had this kind of nice slim wheel that I think went along with this rather slim and tasteful and simple dash. But a dash that I would say looks quite elegant and handsome, very reserved and restrained, especially compared to the Buick dashes of the early 1960s, like the 1960 Buicks, that had the reflectable speedometer, or the drum speedometer that was reflected in a mirror. The 60 and 61 Buicks had that. Here you just have the conventional kind of horizontal speedometer and idiot lights. The only gauge you get is the fuel gauge, and then, of course, you have the clock there off to the right as well. And here's a view of the bench seats in this Electra. Prime seating, well padded, no headrests at this point yet. Those would come a little bit later. And you did get this cool design in the vinyl associated with both the front and rear armrest. Again, kind of tasteful but conservative, something that you would expect from a Buick. And here you have a view of the speedometer and odometer with the 372 and a half miles on it. A super low mileage car. Not quite sure what the story is on this one or why it has such low mileage. And what happens? Sometimes this just happens. Somebody buys the car, then they pass away, then their family keeps the car. I suspect something like that was the story with this one, but You never know. Now let's turn under hood, because this was a special year for Buick. In 1967, they replaced the nailhead engines, the 401 cubic inch, the 425 cubic inch engines that were around in 1966. There were various sizes of nail heads, 364s, etc. But at this point in the Electra, the standard nail head engine was replaced by this new 430 cubic inch V8 that was all new for 1967. And this engine would stay at 430 cubic inches in 1967, 1968, 1969, before being enlarged to 455 cubic inches in 1970. And then the largest Buick V8 would remain a 455 cubic incher until 1976. After that point, the only Buick V8 that was left was the 350 cubic inch V8 for a few more model years before that was dropped entirely. You can tell the Buick V8s because they have a distributor on the front side here, which you can't see. It's behind the radiator hose in front of that air cleaner snorkel. The Cadillac V8s also had the distributor up front, but the Buicks always have the air conditioning compressor and the alternator on the same side. The Cadillac V8s, you'll notice, have the air conditioning compressor in the center. That's how Cadillac located them. Now, this 430 cubic inch V8 made 360 horsepower in 1967, and that was better than in 1966. The standard Electra engine was a 401 cubic inch nailhead V8 that made, I believe, 325 horsepower. And then there was an optional 425 cubic inch nailhead V8 that made 340 horsepower. So you got a bit more horses. I will say that the 67 Buick 430 is in general a good engine. There were some teething problems associated with it, mostly upper end oiling. And so you have to make sure that if you buy one of these engines that the oil was changed rather frequently. Don't buy one where when you take off that oil fill cover there on the driver's side valve cover, that's kind of gummy inside, or you hear lifter ticking. Some of them have like a very faint lifter tick to them, very, very faint when they're running. That's kind of normal. But I would say if you hear some significant lifter ticks, you just want to stay away. These cars did have that issue. And then the oil pumps in some cases were an issue, as well as, I believe the Buicks of this era also had two-piece drive shafts, which was something that was unique to Buick, and not quite sure why they did that. But if you drive a 67 Buick, you'll notice that they all have kind of a bit of a drivetrain wobble from about 5 to 10 miles an hour when you're taking off, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. That just can't be tuned out of the car. That's how they are. So if you accelerate and you feel a little bit of a shudder or a shimmy, that is actually perfectly normal for the full-size Buicks. The Riviera didn't have the same issue, but the full-size Buicks did have that. And you'll notice here in the shot from the passenger side, you can see that big GM A6 air conditioning compressor there. One of the great things about these 1967 Buicks and the 65 to 70 GM cars, I would say in general, is that the fan, the blower fan, you can see it right there, is accessible on the firewall. In the 1971 to 76 generation, you're not going to be as lucky. Some people were cutting holes in the fender aprons there to try to access the blower motor. But in this particular year, in this configuration, at least it's accessible. And you can see the evaporator is also right there and accessible too. Now, the last thing to note here about the 1967 Buicks is that they came with what I think was the most expensive marketing brochure for a mainstream vehicle, not a specialty vehicle, at least that I've ever seen. And that's this so-called Buick book that you see here, the 1967 edition. And they tried to make it look like a magazine, but you notice it says 6 famous models. Look at 6 famous models. In other words, there are a bunch of famous models from the era in this book, and there are also a bunch of actors in it. And I don't know what Buick had to pay all these people, but I've heard that it cost so much that it got the marketing director fired. And in the next year, the 1968 Buick brochure was much less, let's say, expensive. There weren't any of these stars in it at all. So they went from a bunch of stars to 0. And we'll talk more about that in detail because this brochure is actually worth a broader look. You can see here a picture of Robert Lansing sitting in one of the Buicks. He was just one of a number of actors and models that was featured in this 1967 brochure. Thanks again for watching. Put a comment in the comment section. Do you think these Buicks are some of the best looking cars of all time? I sure do. Let me know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed, click that center icon of the 67 Riviera in the middle there. It's free, so you get notified of any of my new videos. Thanks again for watching.